So, a silver lining to some of the strife we're dealing with in America today with regards to race is that it's always good when we're pushed to have difficult conversations. So, here are some of my thoughts on a topic that we as Americans are struggling with right now. I graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point, so I'm going to frame my comments around my alma mater. West Point just completed its newest barracks on campus, which is going to house around 650 cadets. The new facility is called Davis Barracks. Now, building a new facility like this is a big deal for West Point. It's named after Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who graduated with the class of 1936 and was the only African American cadet in his class of 276 cadets. Davis's classmates silenced him, which means that no one spoke to him while he was at West Point except for when they were required to do so as part of their official duties. He never had a roommate, and all of this was because the other cadets at the time didn't think that a black person belonged at West Point. So imagine navigating the rigors of West Point and dealing with all of that at the same time. So I'm not going to even try to tell Davis's full story because I can't do it justice and be succinct at the same time. But after graduating, he led combat missions in World War II as a Tuskegee Airman. He retired as a 3-star general in 1970 and was awarded his 4th star by President Clinton in 1998. Truly a great American story. And it's exciting for me personally that my alma mater is recognizing him in this way. This is a story I think that we all want future generations of American leaders to emulate. So I'm excited that cadets are going to be living in Davis Barracks. Like most places with a long history, West Point has a tradition of heroes that it lionizes. The motto of the history department is, much of the history we teach was made by people we taught. And this is a poster that's plastered everywhere at the academy, or at least it was when I was there. The two West Point presidents, Generals Grant and Eisenhower, General MacArthur, and General Lee. And while you're a cadet, you learn about the other generals, Pershing and Bradley and Patton and Schwarzkopf, but these are the big four. And they all have barracks named after them. That's where the cadets live. But when you look at these four, one of them is unlike the others. Grant was commander of Union forces during the American Civil War. Eisenhower was Supreme Allied Commander in Europe during World War II, and both went on to become President of the United States. MacArthur commanded U.S. forces in the Far East and was a 5-star general. And then there's General Lee. Now, General Lee served a distinguished career as a United States Army officer. He was actually superintendent at West Point for 3 years. But the role for which he is remembered and recognized was as General-in-Chief of the Confederacy. So he fought against the United States. So what should we think about that? Well, first, let's take a look at the cause for which General Lee fought, the Confederacy. Now, when we consider the question of why the states left the Union, we're benefited by the fact that as the states left one by one, they recorded their motives for posterity. Now, several of the states, not all of them did this, but several issued an official declaration of causes, a document. Now, the tone of these declarations is grandiose, it's flowery, these are kind of righteous statements for posterity, but they're certainly not politically correct. I mean, they put it right out there. So let's look at Georgia. The second sentence of their declaration, they cut straight to the chase, citing the subject of African slavery. It declares that the political and social inequality of the African race was fully conceded by the framers of the Constitution, and it goes on in this vein. This document is about slavery. Or how about the state of Texas, the state where I grew up? The Texas document champions the beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery and goes on to lament the debasing doctrine of equality for all men, irrespective of color, of race or color, a doctrine at war with nature and divine law. So that's what the Texas document says. Again, no political correctness there. Or Mississippi, spelled right out at the very beginning of the document, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. There's more. Virginia and South Carolina, they made official declarations, but it essentially goes on in this vein. This is hard stuff to read, but it's history, and it is what it is. And history tells us that this is the cause that Confederate generals fought for. So our nation's Constitution is one of the great political works of human history. But what we're seeing in these declarations is an ugly compromise within our Constitution, the compromise on slavery, spilling out into the open. This was a rift that could only be solved with blood. This is the reason that we fought the Civil War. Now, as for slavery in the Constitution, these are things we study in school. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution legally defined a slave as 3/5 of a white man for census purposes. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution explicitly protected the slave trade for 20 years. It set a maximum tax for importing enslaved persons. Article 4, Section 2 ensured that people who escaped slavery could be recaptured and returned even if that person who was escaping successfully fled to a state where slavery was illegal. So the framers of the Constitution had to address slavery. And they permitted it in order to strike a compromise and get an agreement. But in the entirety of the Constitution, in the whole document, you won't find the word slave or slavery anywhere. The language is coded. Instead of the word slave, the Constitution uses terms like those bound to a service for a term of years or person held to service or labor. But slavery is a theme. And that brings us to another argument. Well, what about the Founding Fathers? They were slave owners too. Aren't they just like the Confederate generals? So to continue the thread, I'll tie this back to another building at West Point. In 2008, West Point completed a new library, Jefferson Hall, named after Thomas Jefferson. And this is his statue in the rotunda. It's hard to overstate the enormous impact that Jefferson had and continues to have on our nation. He was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. He was our nation's third president. And although he wasn't a signer of the Constitution, he was influential in creating its intellectual framework. And he owned slaves. And unlike George Washington, he didn't free his slaves, even in his will. So here's where I land on all of this, and different people who think about this issue will come to different conclusions. I understand that. First, a legacy of white supremacy is an undeniable part of our nation's history. Our founding fathers, the great political geniuses who created this country that we love, also enslaved, bought, and sold other human beings. So we're compelled to celebrate a figure like Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was instrumental in creating the world's greatest democracy. In my opinion, we want cadets studying in a hall named after Thomas Jefferson. But at the same time, we have to recognize that white supremacy and slavery were a fundamental part of American society during Jefferson's lifetime. So even as we celebrate Jefferson's genius, we can't forget that there are dark chapters in our country's history. And lastly, when considering Confederate monuments, context matters. There's a reason why many of these monuments went up, and it's an ugly reason. A lot of these Confederate monuments sprang up in the 50s and 60s in response to Brown versus Board of Education and other desegregation efforts. They were erected to send a message, and they all need to go. When we pull down these monuments, we're not denying history. We're just being thoughtful about what we want to celebrate. Now, Robert E. Lee is always going to have a place in West Point history. But Lee Barracks was built in 1962. Lee Barracks does not have a long history at West Point, and it should be renamed.